begin. Today's topic in large part is American spiritualism, which is a religious movement most commonly associated with seances and mediumship and related modes of demonstrating the possibility of spiritual activity in the world. Spiritualism's origin story is rehearsed often and pretty well known. The Fox sisters, living in Western New York in 1848, developed a system of spirit communication. They would pose questions to a spirit, often while sitting at a table like this, and the spirit would respond by knocking or rapping sounds that, depending on who you asked, seemed to emanate from all corners of the room, or from the underside of the table, or from the floor around the sisters' double-jointed toes. The Foxes then soon took their demonstrations on the road, expanding their repertoire and their circles of communication with time. Partly from those beginnings, then, the modern American spiritualist movement developed. Soon, there were mediums active throughout the country, some of them rapping like the Fox sisters, and others developing more elaborate demonstrations of spirit presence in the world. Some announcing their seances with complex philosophical frameworks and others without. The Davenport brothers, for their part, held seances featuring what they called a spirit cabinet. They would be tied down inside it, but when the doors were closed and the lights turned out, the audience would still hear music playing and see figures moving about on the stage. Now, as you can perhaps imagine, the movement was subject to much debate and indeed criticism. And some of that critique took the form of mocking mimicry. Some anti-spiritualists, whether working in the realm of photography or on the stage as professional magicians, some anti-spiritualists would imitate spiritualist demonstrations and techniques and then belittle people for their adherence to the original product, which they said was just as false as their mocking mock-ups. We see here a couple of spiritualist photographs on the left and their debunking mockeries on the right. It was a kind of, oh yeah, well, we can do that too, game of one-upsmanship, which, as we can see here, and as I'll argue a little bit more in a moment, nevertheless created a kind of visual and discursive and formal vernacular, a common language for debates about spirits and ghosts and religion. Now, that's probably as much preface as we need for today's purposes, for I wish to begin this talk in earnest, a talk in which I hope to recover and reconceive certain spiritualist innovations in and theories of ritual form. I wish to start this talk in earnest with a look precisely at one of these would-be debunkers of spiritualism. So I want to begin with a story about a spiritualist debunker, an anti-spiritualist who planned a demonstration tour in 1850. Dr. Charles Lee had written an expose of the Fox sisters, claiming that their spirit rappings were produced actually by knee and ankle joint crackings. So we join him later that year when he hired then a joint cracker of his own to assist in a lecture on the errors of spiritualism. It was an unsuccessful event by his standards, and he was disheartened by the crowd's response. Here from Lee's report. Quote, "At the proper time, I introduced the assistant to my audience. Standing on an elevated platform and without moving in the least or stirring a single muscle as far as could be observed, he gave a more striking illustration of spiritual knockings than the Foxes ever dreamed of." What was very ludicrous, however, was that several in the audience who now for the first time had witnessed anything in the spiritual knocking line and had remained skeptical up to that point, now became zealous converts to the doctrine of spiritualism, and still refer to my exhibition as the strongest kind of demonstrative argument in its support. So Lee set out to expose spiritualism, but he ended up coining, creating spiritualists. He had planned to tour the entire East Coast, quote, blowing spirit rappers sky high by our demonstrations, in his words, but witnessing this counterintuitive response from the audience, he, quote, abandoned the project and begged my assistant to rap no more, he said, and I've not ventured to lecture or argue on the subject since, fearing a like result. Now, there are many ways to read this story. We, like Lee, could blame audience members for hyper-credulousness and overt superstition, or for confusion and the inability to track with scientific arguments. Or perhaps we could imagine a different scenario in which people thought, well, just because this assistant can produce raps with his knee joints doesn't mean that all mediums do likewise. Or just because some mediums may be tricksters doesn't mean that all are. I want to propose yet another reading, though, one that I hope is slightly more revealing about the nature of 19th century spiritualist appeal and ritual display and religion. Namely that both Lee's role and the audience response make good sense, because Lee was actually part of the spiritualist movement, or rather because he was partially performing spiritualism. And this is because spiritualism, at least in a particular mode, consisted in interpretively open-ended demonstrations, and because it depended for that very openness upon the existence of people like Lee. Debunkers touring in parallel with spiritualists were necessary for spiritualism's formal successes. And where such debunkers were not readily at hand, spiritualist promoters found their own ways to incite critical appraisals of and within spiritualist circles. Spiritualism thus assumed skepticism and operational intrigue, and it constituted itself in displays and spaces for which observers had, or were outright provided, the technologies of disenchantment. So when the Fox sisters announced demonstrations at Rochester in 1849, they did so with the following words: "Let the citizens of Rochester embrace this opportunity of investigating the whole matter and see if those engaged in laying it before the public are deceived or are deceiving others, and if neither, let them account for these truly wonderful manifestations themselves. Come and investigate." Now, the baseline for this paper is here, and its components need only highlighting. The Fox sisters invited critical investigation of their own operations, and they provided to their audience a number of ready-made interpretations to that effect. The mediums themselves may be deceived, they said, or they may be deceiving others. But if something else was at work, then it became the audience's job to think through the possibilities, to make meaning, and to determine utility. Spiritualist rituals were scripted performances for which viewers received a critical apparatus. Come and investigate, the medium said. Now, the Fox sisters' incitements to examination were famous, and they soon became part of the show itself. Each audience would elect a 5-person committee to meet privately with Leah and Maggie after the main demonstration to investigate further, and then report their findings during the next night's performance. Most reports claimed inconclusiveness. They could not be entirely sure what was happening, they said, and so more inquiry and information would be necessary, and the process then began anew. Thus, when the group of Buffalo doctors, of which Charles Lee was a member, decided to debunk the Fox sisters in a lengthy committee report, they partly played a role that was commissioned and prefigured. They became part of the same phenomenon as these other groups and committees, perhaps, in the words of one commentator, helping the growth of spirit rapping more than they hurt it. This irony is apparent in Dr. Lee's solo debunking tour, the frustrated account of which launched this paper. Lee found that when he mimicked the sisters' rappings, having first explained his hypothesis about their naturalistic origins, his audience considered it a wonderful spiritualist demonstration. By this, they perhaps meant, and I do mean, that Lee's rappings were ambiguous forms, that they were acts performed amid a variety of interpretive frames, both provided and assumed, and that they were acts which were, in any case, offered up to the audience's critical and operational consideration. For both Lee and the Foxes established spaces wherein people, while watching performances and looking for their winks and wires, thought through the meaning of spirit evocation in the modern world, what it might look like if communication were achieved, what it might look like if communication were faked, and what might be the social significance of both scenarios. Okay. I'm frozen here, so I'm gonna wait for 1 moment. Well, my slides seem to unfreeze, or I hope will unfreeze.
If it does, oh, never mind.
So we can get to all this explanatory ground faster, I think, if we detour through the work of a very important 19th century theorist of aesthetics and religion, namely P.T. Barnum. Now, P.T. Barnum, proprietor of the American Museum in New York and of the traveling Barnum Circus. P.T. Barnum. The first connection to make between the Fox sisters and P.T. Barnum is evident when we look at Barnum's theory of advertising and audience interest. So some historians have described Barnum as having, and as assuming his audience to have also, an operational aesthetic. By this they mean that Americans were excited by the opportunity to debate the mechanics of different displays of industry, of natural specimens, and of ostensibly superhuman ability. And that Barnum then catered to that excitement by first hosting questionable displays, by raising questions about them himself, and then by encouraging debate among the audience. Barnum's philosophy of taste dictated that Americans would find interesting and beautiful those things that they could examine and critique. And the more information provided and produced in their debates, the better. So Barnum learned early that an exhibitor did not have to guarantee truthfulness. All he had to do was possess probability and invite doubt. The public would be more excited by controversy than by conclusiveness. The only requirement was to keep the issue alive and in print. Thus, when Barnum took Joyce Heth on tour, she was supposedly the centuries-old former nurse of George Washington, he placed two types of advertisements in the local paper. One that applauded the unique window into history provided by this ancient and important woman, and another that denounced the show, saying that Joyce Heth was a fake, perhaps even an automaton. And later, when he exhibited a real whale in his museum, he likewise encouraged rumors that it was an automaton. Or again, with a so-called mermaid body, he published conflicting reports from doctors about whether it was really just two creatures sewn together, concluding that, quote, when doctors disagree, the people must decide for themselves. You have to decide for yourself how this works and whether it can work for you, Barnum implied. Come out and investigate. And here his methods echo the Fox's. Now, the second connection to make between P.T. Barnum and the Fox sisters builds upon this first one by looking at part of Barnum's aesthetic theory, his theory of humbug. Humbug is a term that's generally taken to indicate tricks or fakery, but when used by Barnum himself as a term both for suspicious practices and also for necessary intellectual positions and processes, it's more interesting. Humbug, as explained by Barnum, was a technique of publicity. It was a set of claims or acts designed to arouse excitement around a particular good. But it was important that there be a product, and that it in fact be good or at least decent for such publicity to work, and for the term humbug itself to be warranted. So consider this example as provided by Barnum. There were two physicians, both equally credentialed and competent. One rides about quietly about the city, visiting his patients without noise or clamor, while the other sallies out in his coach preceded by a musical band with his carriage and horses covered by handbills and placards announcing his wonderful cures. The second man is properly called a humbug. Why? Not because he cheats or imposes upon the public, for he doesn't, but because humbug consists in putting on glittering appearances, outside show, novel expedients, by which to suddenly arrest public attention and attract the public eye and ear. But if it was all glitter and no product, if his medicine didn't work, then he was a simple fraud. So by Barnum's account, in order to be considered a humbug rather than a fraud or a cheat or someone insufficiently interesting to have any moniker at all, you needed to provide a service. There had to be something there. Beyond tangible products, a humbug could provide two services: a space for productive thought and debate, or as an extension of this, signposts to proper religion. Now, we've already encountered the first of these. Americans enjoyed watching shows and visiting exhibits that they suspected might be contrived, Barnum said, because they enjoyed the intellectual exercise of it all. Barnum's Americans were proudly scientific people, people accustomed to, as one historian has described the age, to the continual appearance of new marvels, and also to a jargon that concentrated on methods of operation, on aspects of mechanical construction, on horsepower, gears, pulleys, and safety valves. They were both easily marveled and profoundly analytical. And these were good complementary qualities, according to Barnum. The important thing, he thought, was to provide a space in which people could play with the boundary between marvel and analysis, and between credulity and skepticism, and where they could think through the conditions of modern life. And so Barnum, as a humbug himself, was also a theorist of its provision. He was a theorist of the displays and the forms that would enable this kind of critical play and of critical analysis. Barnum spent 9 of the 50 chapters in his book, Humbugs of the World, treating spiritualism, and with some good reason. True to his definition of humbug and consistent with his own business model, many spiritualists didn't fear public suspicion, but rather invited it. They, like Barnum, at least as Neil Harris has described him, they understood that the opportunity to debate the issue of truth and falsity, to discover if and how deception had been practiced, was even more exciting than the discovery of fraud itself. And most importantly, they set up performative spaces for just this type of audience debate and discovery. The Fox sisters, as we've already seen, laid out the terms of debate and challenged people to investigate. Meanwhile, another rapping medium, M.V. Bly, also announced his seances in similar terms. In fact, Bly's business and religious model is especially interesting for present purposes. He would let audience members come to their own conclusions, some of them deciding that he had special powers of communication, others deciding that he was a sleight of hand artist at best, and still others figuring somewhere in the middle. And he would happily meet any and all of these people again, he said, after they'd taken the time to consider his demonstrations a bit. If they came back pleased by the utility and pertinence of his mediumistic communications, he might continue in that same vein. If, however, they came back with a particular sleight of hand theory, charging Bly with a specific fraud and demanding an explanation, he was known to admit winkingly to some exaggeration and gameful falsification on that score. In fact, in time, he started a side business debunking his own day job. Still, he insisted that there was something in it, and he defended both types of his demonstrations as useful, insofar as they afforded ever unfolding opportunities to debate the issue of truth and falsity. Bly's performances thus generated critical debate, not only about their own operation, but also about this life, the next life, and the possibility of some spiritual intermediation between them, the existence of which Bly maintained even when he refused to stand up for the absolute veracity of his own proofs. Now, such incitements to debate and such ambiguous ritual displays were features also of the more explicitly and intentionally debunking campaigns too. So even von Vleck, the man that P.T. Barnum himself hired to perform spiritualist exposures. And here you can see, if you can read it, that von Vleck's performance was slotted between a comic number called Dancing Giraffe and some life-size figures of Japanese persons. Even von Vleck was a sometimes silent partner behind a touring spiritualist couple. His one condition for partnership was that the couple avoid prescriptive statements about the truth of their spirit manifestations. He thought it would be more interesting and also better business if the crowd decided for itself what it thought. That way, they could keep the debate open, and people might be more inclined to attend both spiritualist and debunking shows in the future just to keep it going. Finally, we see also in this advertisement from the famous magician and debunker J.H. Anderson, a bit of this dynamic too. promises of debunkings here on the right are published adjacent to announcements of spiritualist growth and power on the left as it faces you. The juxtaposition of which framed a challenge to the public. Come to this performance equipped with at least these two interpretive frames and see what you think. So, in an environment like this, where performers assumed and suggested that people come to their own critical conclusions, where they performed ambiguities announced with ambivalence, or better yet, where the ostensible certainty of either performance or interpretation was belied by the ambiguity of the other. Our original debunker, Charles Lee, should not have been surprised by some of the responses he got, just as his spiritualist counterpart should not have been surprised to see people swing in the opposite direction. Neither instance is explained satisfactorily as a matter of pre-scientific survival or of unthinking credulity or the like. Now I'll end by anticipating the inevitable question. Are you saying that the Fox sisters or other spiritualist mediums of their ilk were humbugging and tricking people? I think it's an interesting question in some ways, but I hope to have challenged us to think deeper about why that's the question we ask. Or better yet, I hope to have shown that we would first need to consider the fact that the Foxes themselves invited that question. They wanted to generate discussion about their performances and their methods, and about the source and meaning of their wrappings. Secondly, we'd want to ask ourselves, just as 19th century Americans asked themselves, what is meant by the verb tricking? Humbug, as we've seen, was a technical term embracing an elaborate theory of social interest and intellection, one that assumed that a public good of some sort was provided by constructing spaces of debate and consideration. For Barnum, for what it's worth, the hopeful endgame of religious humbuggery would be some form of philosophical stance, social benevolence, and universalistic theology. The Fox sisters, meanwhile, and for their part, seem to have been less concerned with the endgame of debates engendered in their spaces. It was the fact of debate itself, as affected through proper performance and properly critical inquiry, that they cared about. And as both theorists and providers of ritual, they inaugurated a religious form, complete with critical apparatus, that audiences could recognize even in the work of debunkers like Lee. But still, were they cheating? The Fox sisters released conflicting statements throughout their lives and career, the very fact of which, the conflict and the ongoing profusion of interpretive data, should itself tell us something about their vocation, sometimes calling themselves fakes, sometimes authentic. As authentic fakes, though, they might have agreed with Robert Browning's character, Mr. Sludge the Medium, who stated, when his cover was blown and his tricks uncovered, I admit it's all absurd, and yet there's something in it. How much? No answer. You've heard what I confess. I don't unsay a single word. I cheated when I could, wrapped with my toe joints and all the rest. Believe that, but also believe this. By the same token, it seemed to set the crooked man straight again, this trade of mine. There was something in it, tricks and all. He cheated, the medium said, but there was something in it. And so too did Leah Fox's published defense steadfastly claim that there was something in it, even while Kate Fox concurrently announced her knocking to be all humbuggery. It's our job to figure out what that something might be. And to that end, I think our 19th century theorists have provided some footholds. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Professor Walker.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of great questions in the chat, so thank you to everyone who put those in. I'm excited to hear your response. So the first one that we have is a lot of debunkers who've attacked mediumship throughout history have been linked to stage magic like Houdini. Does stage magic have any relevance as a subject of religious studies? And then second part to the question, has there been research on that kind of explicit miraculous performance?
I love this question. Yeah, so as a religious studies scholar, I'll say the following things, or someone interested in the history of religion. First, that I think that magic, here's some, I'll put it this way, here are some building block statements about magic as a term and as about magicians as practitioners thereof from my perspective as a scholar of religion. Magic as a term and a practice is and has always been concerned with policing the boundaries between of religion, the boundaries of religion. Magic is a contrast term marking that which is not religion, that which is not modern, that which is not science. So self-styled magicians like Houdini then are sort of players of the not modern. They're players of the not modern to modern effect. They are, in Robert Houdin's famous phrase, actors playing the role of magicians, actors who pretend to have exceptional powers, if only to highlight the pretenses of that pretense itself. Actors poised as if to say, look, we're all doing this by natural means, by sleight of hand, by illusion. So don't believe those fakers down the road that do similar stuff and claim divine power. We're too smart for that, they would say. Some of these sort of magical debunkers might say, and then that pseudo-religious fakery has no place in the modern world. So then magicians, by donning that same professional title, magicians, capital M, assert that there's no place for, say, table rapping acts in the modern world except as secular entertainment, right? But then sort of less obviously, the pervasiveness of magicians as pop cultural icons and their success as professionals depends in large part, I think, on the degree to which they play with the boundaries between magic and modernity and religion, the degree that is to which the left hand blurs then the writings of the right? The left hand blurs the degree to which they establish precisely these boundaries between magic and science and religion, let's say. And so then, regardless of their occasional rhetoric to the contrary, this is true not only of capital M magicians, who those like Houdini and Houdin, who act in hopes of sort of demagifying the world. It's also true of the so-called spiritualists and shamans and lowercase m magicians, people to whom magicians, capital M magicians, deny attributions of either religion or scientific thought or modernity writ large. They too also play with precisely these boundaries and these categories of analysis. Now, one thing that I'll mention is that in the sort of broader project that I'm working on precisely here, I'm looking also at the ways that magicians sort of not only create and sort of not only like mimic spiritualist behavior on stage in order to debunk it. And this is a sort of co-constitutive relationship and a codependent relationship that emerged precisely between spiritualism and magicians through much of the 19th century. But I'm looking not only at the way that magicians, then these capital M magicians that I'm talking about now, create then the sort of idea of the spiritualist other, thus creating in some ways the religion and the rhetoric of religion therein, but also play with the space of ambiguity and precisely within their own shows. So with Houdini, it's well known that he was locked in a sort of pitched battle against spiritualism for much of the later part of his life before he died in 1926. But what's less known is that also sort of behind the scenes, he was sourcing spiritualists with some of the information about how he was going to debunk them. Spiritualists in turn were also sourcing him with some information about what they were going to do precisely in their shows so that they would enter in this sort of relationship of precisely this sort of ambiguous codependence as they would go on. Houdini also did this, sort of evoked and effected this type of critical ambiguity in some of his own shows, but then also in some of his movies in this latest part of his life. So The Man from Beyond is an example that I like to show sometimes in classes, where he sort of, notwithstanding his official stance against spiritualism, actually enacts a role of spiritualism and about spiritualism and a defense of, in some ways, Arthur Conan Doyle's work in precisely this film that existed alongside his debunking campaigns. Sorry, that's sort of a long answer. I hope that got at some of what you were asking though.
Great, thank you. And just because you, I'll skip a couple of questions down, since you were talking about what drives spiritual or interest in magic today. Someone did ask, would doubt be a factor that continues to fuel interest in spirit communication? You kind of touched on it, but if there's anything you want to add.
Absolutely, absolutely. Doubt and skepticism continue to drive interest in precisely the phenomena that we're talking about in the modern world. What I'm trying to do in large part in this talk and in my work generally is to look at how spiritualists themselves are not oblivious to, neither were they in the 19th century nor are they now, this type of sort of doubt and skepticism, but actually invite that into the substance of their own ritual culture. So it's a project of recovering the space of sort of, and the performance of criticism, doubt, skepticism as part of the stuff and substance and the ritual apparatus of religion itself.
Great points. Thank you. Did Blythe debunk his own performances or those of others? And was it more phrased, well, they're cheating, but I'm the real deal? Or did he actually reveal part of his own game?
A little of both, all of the above. He performed variously in the US and then in Great Britain as alternately a spiritualist or a debunker of spiritualism. He sometimes did indeed sort of debunk his own operations. That's why I was joking about him being a sort of nighttime debunker of his own day job. He did sometimes reveal some of what he was doing, all the while reiterating his baseline that although what he's doing was in some ways sleight of hand tricks, it was designed to invite precisely the reflection on the nature of the real and the nature of the sleight of hand. So yes, he did actually explicitly debunk himself, all the while also debunking others for not doing it right, or debunking others for not willing to sort of perform precisely in the space of ambiguity that he was trying to recover as the stuff and substance of real religion.
Awesome.
Another project that I'm working on is trying to look at a group of spiritualists and anti-spiritualist debunkers who sort of came together around the World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair of 1893, and sort of performed in one spirit house for a little while, even while they were both performing or continuing their separate vocations on the side, either as spiritualists or as debunkers of what they were doing in that spirit house. That's another project just to sort of flag some of the places I'm trying to go with this work.
That's great. If there's anything you want me to include in the follow-up about that, I'm happy to do that. I'm sure people would be interested. Thank you for all that information. We've got some really great comments in the chat. So thank you to everyone who promoted discussion in the chat, who posed a question. That's really great. It's always my favorite part of these events. Just as to close out, thank you, Professor Walker, for speaking. This was a really great talk. The recording of this event will be available on our website this week, but you will also receive a follow-up email that contains the information that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, as well as the recording and a couple of other bits in it. You'll get that early next week. Our next Profs of the Pub will be November 4th. You don't have to remember that. You'll all get an email because you're now on our Profs at the Pub list. You'll all get an email about the next edition, and it's featuring an Italian studies professor. So that'll be exciting. Once again, thank you so much, Professor Walker. If there's anything you want me to include in the follow-up, I can totally do that and share any information you want with everyone else.
Thank you. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.